Welcome to Asian Book Club, where we highlight Asian and Asian American authors. We are your hosts,
Jamae and Sabangan.
and I'm Stephen Park. And today we bring you our first read of Blossoms on a Poisoned Sea. But before we do that, I wanted to talk about our last read, which is Snow Globe by Soyoung Park. And every now and then, when we release our episodes, I'll go back and listen to some of them.
Mm-hmm.
And as I was listening back to some of the first episodes where we were kind of making guesses about where the book was going, I realized we did a pretty good job of really figuring out the plot lines and getting a sense of where the story was going to go.
That's interesting because when we were going through the book itself and making our predictions, I felt like we were throwing spaghetti at the wall.
hmm Some of the stuff that we ended up getting right was the fact that there were multiple headies.
Mm-hmm.
We knew about the prison that was in that underground space. We knew there was corruption. I think originally we thought that the evil character would be the grandmother and not Director Cha.
Right.
So it's not like we got everything right, but I feel like plot wise, there was a lot that we were able to decipher. And then I kind of wonder, was that something we did well, or was that something the author did well?
I think it's a little bit of both. We've been reading together for quite some time now. We're 15 books in. And I think as we continue honing in our skills as readers, we're getting better at putting our finger on the pulse.
hmm Yeah, we're getting better at reading these books and getting a better sense of what's going on with them. And I think that's really kind of helping us to understand not only where the books are going, but get a bigger picture of the scenes that the authors are building. I think it's giving us a sense of what the world is looking like as the author is creating it. So it's been really fun, and I'm really glad that we are getting better at it.
For sure. And like you said, it might also be the author that's making it easy for us to catch on. Like we mentioned during most of the episodes, there were Chekhov's guns all over the place, and that allowed us to guess and predict where the story was going.
hmm And some books are going to be better at that than others. We're going to find books that we get all these hints and little details that are going to help us to figure out the ending. But other books are going to be just stories, like stories that you follow, which is kind of what Blossoms on a Poison Sea kind of feels like,
Mm-hmm.
is that it's more of a story that we're going on a journey with. The fact that it's based on historical nonfiction makes it so that we know some of the consequences of the things that might have happened.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that we're following a very specific grouping of characters that we're experiencing that situation with them.
Totally.
Speaking of people that are really good at sharing stories and taking you along for journeys, Jamae's going to go into our recommendation for the week.
Our recommendation for the week is Jaden Animations. Jaden Animations is an illustrator, animator, and YouTuber who's known for sharing life stories in a comedic way. They're also known for their pet bird, Ari. You can learn more about Jaden's work through their website at jadenanimations.com. That's JAIDENANIMATIONS.com. And you can find them on YouTube at Jaden Animations.
Yep, and some of Jaden Animation's content involved video games, it involves streaming, it involves kind of more playful things. So if you're into that world, especially more of like the NES or the computer gaming world, you might really like the way that she kind of tells those stories.
Yeah. And it's also for those who like D&D because they've, I think, released two D&D plays.
Wow, cool. So that's Jaden Animations, and you can find her on YouTube or on her website. And that's going to be our recommendation for the week. Okay, so first read of Blossoms on a Poisoned Sea by Mariko Tatsumoto. Now, our first read involved pages 1 through 83 and chapters 1 through 10.
Yes, and we'd like to start by thanking the author for giving us an ebook copy of the book. Thank you, Mariko Tatsumoto, for gifting this to us.
Yep, and so let's kind of get into the story. The story starts off in the present day and it looks back on the history of events.
Yes.
So we are entering the home of Kuge Kiyoshi and Kuge Yuki, who are, I think, a married couple at this time.
Mm-hmm.
And we're looking at this through the lens of a reporter named Sawada. As this first chapter ends, we're immediately transported into their life in 1956 in Japan. More specifically, a lot of the events take place in Minamata City.
Definitely. And we are greeted by Kiyoshi, or Kiyo for short, and Yuki, who are both 14 at this time.
Right. Initially, we follow Kiyo's story, and one thing we find out pretty quickly is Kiyo's background is one of wealth and one of privilege.
Mm-hmm.
He is given a lot in the fact that his parents take really good care of him. He goes to really good schooling. He really doesn't have to worry about life because his father works a very prestigious job at the Chiso factory.
Yes. And their family is so prestigious and so well off that the mother doesn't even need to work.
Yep. And on top of that, they are able to do things that are out of the scope of other families, like celebrate birthdays, which is a very
Mm,
American tradition that is just starting to be found out in Japan.
right. On the other hand, Yuki's family is different. They live in a fisher's village with no paved roads, and their home is the size of Kiyo's living room.
Right. And it's also very meager. What we see for their fireplace is a hole in the ground.
Hmm.
What we see for their family are rooms that are delegated to the amount of people that are there. So her parents have a room that is shared with Yuki, and her uncle, who had moved in after his wife, Yuki's aunt, had passed away, is living in the other room. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not like they have a ton to spare, but they have just enough to get by.
Right.
Another really important thing about Yuki's family is that because they don't have a lot of money, they are provided their subsistence from the ocean or the Minamata Bay.
Mm-hmm.
So they get a lot of their food, their finances, and all their resources from this bay where they can then eat, survive, and then also pay the other things that they need to pay.
Definitely. Despite this difference between Kyo and Yuki, though, somehow they form this relationship that's pretty sweet. Even though Kyo is from this well off family, Kyo seems to be very cognizant about the world around him. While Yuki, on the other hand, though she has this very artistic side to her, also is very cognizant of the world and knowing that she might not be able to pursue this passion.
Right. And they end up meeting on this random day, which ends up being both of their birthdays. And as they meet each other, Yuki meets Kyo with his new bike. And Kyo is kind of showering Yuki with not necessarily affection, but in a sense, love.
Yeah, very platonic love at this point.
Right. And so they begin to share lives. Kyo ends up visiting her family and getting to know her mother, father, and her uncle. Yuki is not really involved in Kyo's life in any way up to this point,
Mm-hmm.
except for the fact that he treats her so well. And in turn, I think she and her family give him a lifestyle that he just probably doesn't have available at his house,
Right.
especially knowing that his father, who has such a well off job, it shows through several different lenses that he's often not home and often not available for Kyo.
Mm-hmm. And it's also unfortunate that despite all this love that he's getting from Yuki's family, Kyo's father still holds his nose up to them.
Right. Something we're going to find out later.
Yes.
As we're going to this read, clearly Kyo and Yuki's story is going to be the big one
Mm-hmm.
because in the end of things, when we look at that first chapter that shows us the present day, we see that they are together and they're happy together. What we start to glean from these initial chapters is this widespread disease that is starting to affect the community. Not only is it affecting different animals, especially cats, we see the image of a lot of cats kind of starting to lose their mind and jump off of things and do things that are harmful to themselves. But we also start to see individuals and humans becoming hospitalized and sickened and eventually becoming plagued to the point of death.
Right. And unfortunately, one of the people that do catch the sickness is Yuki's uncle, Higano.
Right. And this was such an interesting thing for me because his process was so long. We initially saw him stumbling and start to have difficulties 8 months before he got sent to the hospital.
Right.
The first story that we get is Higano not being able to stand after breakfast and Yuki having to take him to the bus station and pretty much throwing him on her shoulder just to get him onto the bus.
Mhm.
At that point, there has to be a sense that something is massively wrong with Higano.
Well, we know that there was something wrong with Higano as readers, but I think the family also knew that because there's a point where Kazuko, Yuki's mom, says, "We keep wanting to bring him to the hospital, but Higano, refuses."
Yeah, but Wouldn't you at that point, if it was someone in your family that's refusing care, kind of encourage them strongly, if not to the lines of forcing them to go to a hospital?
I agree. Like, if they're not able to get up on their own and if they need our support to stay standing or even sitting up, I agree. I would have been very adamant about bringing them to the hospital. But who knows? I don't know if the family dynamics might have been different for them.
Right. We do know that they don't have a lot of money, and I wasn't sure if that played the factor to Higano's maybe guilt if he were to go to the hospital,
Mm,
especially after seeing what happened with his wife and the troubles that they had to go through just to get her the treatment that she needed.
right. And it could also be the trauma from his wife's sickness, seeing her deteriorate and knowing that that was how he might have his end as well.
Right. And ultimately, I don't think it would have mattered whether they took him in at the 8 month mark or if they took him in when he did,
Mm,
because no one really knows what's going on. There are hints and signs of things that they're seeing, and the doctors are putting a massive push to try to figure what is going on.
mhm.
We have the hospitals gathering data as quickly as they could. We have Kumamoto University having some researchers around the clock trying to figure this stuff out. But ultimately, we don't know what's going on at this point.
Right. There are no answers. And even at the end of the 10 chapters, we have nothing except for the possibility that the water is the cause.
Yep. What we do have, though, is Kyo. Kyo, at the age of 14, knows that he wants to be a doctor. So, through his eyes and through his narrative, we get to see what's going on in the hospital. So, he is provided the opportunity through his father to follow Dr. Hosokawa at the hospital that a lot of these patients are being sent. Keo starts to see the disease progress. He sees people go through the same phases that he saw cats go through
Mhm.
right before they went to the end of their life.
Right.
So we see what's happening through the process of this disease, all because of Keo.
And we're seeing not only what's happening in the hospital, but what's happening at Kumamoto University and the type of research that's going on.
Yep. Because Kyo gets this opportunity at Kumamoto University through Dr. Hosokawa so that he can work with these researchers to figure out what's going on with the disease.
And it's also through him where we see what's possibly causing the sickness in the water, which is the metals.
Right. And that's going through the corruption of his father, Kichiro.
hmm
So, what we know so far is the disease is one that eventually starts paralyzing people. Via the book, I wanted to get this quote because we know that it's an infliction that happened to people in Japan in 1956.
hmm
Once again, because this is a historical nonfiction, these are true events that are just being twisted and told in a different way so that we get a narrative point of view, but it doesn't mean that this stuff is fictional.
Right.
So the quote from this book that explains this disease is, quote, "First the hands and feet become numb so they have trouble walking and gripping things. After a while, they can't control limbs or muscles at all. Their mouths seize up so tightly they can't open them to eat. Vision narrows until they finally go blind, deaf as well. And all the while they're in terrible pain, seems to be some sort of neurological problem." The other thing that we know is that Minamata Bay has these fish that are starting to die. They don't know
Mm.
why, but they're floating up. There are other fish in the water that are okay, they're alive, but they're not swimming well and they're not swimming healthy.
Right. And they're swimming in such a way that even the children are able to just pick them up out of the water.
Yep. And on top of all that, when Kyo ends up having a conversation with his father seems to be very avoidant of this topic, and he forces their family not to eat any fish. Not even from the bay, but just overall, not any fish because he's afraid of where it might come from and what it might do to their family.
Right. So he knows that the wastewater that's coming from the Chiso factory is probably the reason that people are getting sick.
Yep. It's probably the reason why Uncle Higano got sick. And I'm gonna assume by the last conversation that Kyo had with Yuki's family, it might be the reason why some of Yuki's remaining family members get sick.
hmm
Before we go into those predictions, do you know what this sickness is or what this affliction is in terms of real life storytelling?
Personally, no. I was thinking about researching it, but instead I wanted the story to tell me about it.
Okay. Do you want me to tell you about it?
Tell me.
Okay, for any listeners that want to just go along with the story, feel free to skip forward maybe 30 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
What's happening here, I think, is the mercury poisoning that has happened in Japan at that time. The waters were poisoned from a factory that was dumping its waste there, and with Kichiro being the lead of the waste disposal at the Chiso factory, he probably has a direct correlation to where that disposal is going.
Mm.
So I'm almost certain that this is that mercury poisoning that they had at that time, and that's what's affecting these people currently in the story.
I feel like no. I know that there was mercury poisoning in Japan, and I just didn't put two and two together, but that makes sense.
Yeah. So let's go into predictions then. Because once again, we have our story, we have our history, and we know what we know.
Mm-hmm.
But what we don't know is what happens to Kiyo and Yuki.
Right.
So what do you think is going to happen with this storytelling?
Moving forward, seeing how Yuki lost her uncle and then later losing Jiro, her cat, I think she's going to continue losing family members, especially since her father was very adamant about continuing to get food from the sea.
Yeah, I forgot about Jiro. Yuki's cat Jiro passes because of the disease. And we saw Yuki's mom feeding Jiro like all the intestines from the fish. And
Yes,
always said that Jiro ate very well.
right.
I completely forgot about that. Poor Jiro.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with you. I think her family members are going to continue to be inflicted and affected. I don't know who is going to go through this process, but eventually I do think that that's going to lead to a clash between Yuki and Kiyo's family.
Mm-hmm.
Because we already see the clash from Kiyo's family onto Yuki's family,
Right,
and how much looking down upon we see from Kichiro. Kiyo is seemingly going to have to break away from his father and sever that relationship, whether it was good or bad. We are only getting a sense of the lack of relationship that he has had with his father.
right.
But I do think there's going to be a lot of relational distrust and a lot of relational breaking so that the story can end with Yuki and Kyo ending up together.
Mm-hmm. Because we know that they do end up together.
Right. What do you think of this book and storytelling so far?
So far, I think that the storytelling goes by pretty quickly. For me, at least, I have a difficult time getting the cadence of the book within the first few chapters. But once I hit chapter 5, I flew past into chapter 10.
Yeah, I feel like the easiest way to describe the storytelling is that the book seems like one long sentence. It seems very fluid and it seems like you're just going on this smooth ride. Like if you were at Disneyland and you were riding the what is problematic log ride and you're just kind of floating along that water and just kind of like chilling out. That's what this book seemed like.
Or you can say it's like going to a water park and going through a lazy river.
I have never been to a water park because I think it's gross that so many kids pee in that water. So I would not be chilling in yellow infested waters. That probably has more mercury than the Minamata Bay.
I don't think you'd have mercury. Whatever is in pee is what would be there.
Urine. The other thing I thought of, because I also had some difficulty getting through the first 5 chapters, was trying to figure out how to imagine these characters.
Mm,
Once I started thinking of these characters as something else, and this is hopefully not to come off as stereotyped or fitting this into a bubble because it's Japanese, but it's much more the image that popped into my head. And since then, it really helped me start to read and be able to figure out what I'm seeing as I'm reading these words. But it gave me very strong Studio Ghibli vibes.
mm,
The main reason being that if you've ever watched those films, it is that slow paced, character driven story where you just follow these characters do day to day lives. So when we followed Keo ride his bike and kind of just see things, that gave me strong images of one of the characters either going to the ocean and, there's even that fishing scene, which we've seen from other characters from those movies. So I think that's why it's so strongly related to those movies and those Miyazaki films. But once I started reading it with those images in my mind, with Kyo yelling and screaming like one of the children in those films and everything that kind of combined, it really started to bring the book to life for me.
Does this mean you're thinking of it in animated form?
Yeah. So all the
Nice.
kids are very animated. And yeah, just like the animation styles of Miyazaki, that's how I see Kiyo and Yuki. And the uncle was like a little bit chubbier and then eventually like shriveled down, but became like one of those characters. So it very much is that film in my mind.
I see. What else stood out to you about this first part of the book?
The easy reading style was the main thing for me that stood out. I feel like I'm still getting into the book, so it's probably a question that I can answer more next time.
For sure.
But did you have anything that stood out for you?
Yes, I know that we say this very often, but I had to point it out. There are moments in this book where Mariko uses Japanese words, and following the Japanese word is a quick translation into the rest of the conversation. And usually, I don't like when there are translations within the story, but for some reason, like you said, it flows so smoothly that I'm thankful that those translations are there.
Yeah, it's almost written as one thought. You
Mm-hmm.
think a word and then you think the translation of it, which sometimes that's how I also process my Korean,
For
is I'll
sure.
think of the word and then I process out the translated version of that.
Mm,
So when I read it, I had the same feelings that you did, where it seemed very fluid and it didn't seem like a piece that took me away from the story.
for sure.
So we know a little bit about what's going on, but we're just beginning this story. So I don't think we have the whole picture yet. Hopefully, by the second read, we'll get a much bigger image of everything that's going on, but we won't know that until we actually do our second read. So,
Mhm.
what is that read?
We are reading pages 84 through 168 in the physical copy, and for everyone, that's chapters 11 through 20.
Yep. And for people that want to share their thoughts or reach out to us, how can people do so?
You can email us at asianbookclubpod@gmail.com or join the conversation on Instagram at asianbookclubpod.
And we have our website, which is asianbookclubpod.com, that has our bookstore where you can find books that we've read in the past, books that we recommend, and books that we plan to read in the future.
And a great way to support us is to rate, review, and subscribe.
Otherwise, make sure to be happy, be healthy, and read a book.
Ingat!
Bye.
Bye!